So before we start, I wanted to acknowledge again Troy Smith from the Library of Congress is has joined us, and he presented to our group in September of 23. This is a chance to plug our website where we have an archive that includes nearly all of the presentations that have been made to this group, and his was done in September of 2023. Uh, Troy, would you like to say a few words about the Library of Congress?
Hi, hi, Joel.
Hi,
Um, I'm at IKEA right now,
great.
uh, and I am tuning in just in time for the talk, and very much looking forward to it. Um, and I just wanted to say that uh, we we're very happy to be in contact with the Sons of Norway and to share our vast Norwegian and Norwegian American library resources with you all. And I'm always happy to be on hand. If you have any genealogy or history reference questions about Norway or Norwegian America, I am available at tsmith@loc.gov. So please do be in touch if there's anything I can do. And thank you to Alexis for inviting me to this presentation. I very much look forward to it.
Thank you, Troy. I'm going to start by introducing our two speakers. And I wanted to say that they're both eminent and distinguished scientists in their own fields. And I know that Katja is distinguished because she's the William Cooper Distinguished University Chair at the University of Rochester. So
Actually, Richmond. I'm a little farther south and out of the snow.
What did I say? Did I say it wrong?
Rochester, which is a lovely place, but not the direction that I moved from. I'm relatively close to the lodge still.
Right. University of Richmond. I went to the University of Rochester. So, uh, and we also have Alexis Steen, who's a distinguished marine scientist, retired now, but she was quite accomplished in dealing with oil spills and environmental regulation, management of research and regulatory approvals. In retirement, she's focused on 2Gs, gardening and genealogy. She enjoys the discovery of ancestors while acquiring a better knowledge of Norwegian history. And as many of you know, she co-chairs this group. And I can tell you that she more than carries her weight. She's responsible for much of the improvement that we've had in this group over the last year. So, without further ado, you want to start out, Katja?
Sure. So, good afternoon, everybody. If we've got folks dialing in from Norway, Gukvel, nice to have you here. So, before I do my presentation, I do just want to put in a plug for our cultural skills program. We are running a genealogy pin challenge. You can get those lovely rosemalling pins to wear at lodge events. So if you've got any questions about that, email me at culturalskills@norwaydc.org and we can get you started on that pathway. So aside from doing cultural skills pins, I am an epidemiologist and I specialize in infectious disease epidemiology. Usually that means looking at things that are happening now, not things that happened 700 some years ago, but same science works when we look backwards. So I'm going to do a relatively brief overview of what plague is. And what it is today and what it was in the past. And I'm going to focus on things not specific to Norway. And then I'm going to turn this over to Alexis, who is going to talk specifically about the situation in Norway back when this was bad several centuries ago. So I'm going to go ahead and start doing screen sharing. And so we're going to talk about the epidemiology of Black Death, which is not a happy thing to talk about, unfortunately, but it is an important part of history that really did drive a lot of changes demographically, socially, economically. So before we get into talking about plague, I'd like you to pause for a moment and think about what life was like for your ancestors hundreds of years ago, in Norway or elsewhere, pretty much anywhere in the world hundreds of years ago. People were living in dark, smoky, cold houses. They had uncomfortable beds. For a lot of the year, when it wasn't the growing season, they had very meager, boring diets, no access to modern medicine, even painkillers. So people would have had a lot of headaches and arthritis and body aches that they couldn't do anything about. Frequent infections, no antibiotics, no vaccines. They would have bathed rarely. They were wearing a lot of wool clothes that would have been caked in mud. They shared their homes often with livestock by intention and with rodents not by intention. They had no insect repellent. They had no bug killers. And so I'd like you to think about how your ancestors would have felt. They would have been miserably itchy all of the time. So hundreds of years ago, most people in the world had lice and mites and insect bites and rashes. Even the richest kings and queens would have been miserable all the time. So just putting that in context as we're trying to think about what our ancestors may have experienced. So plague specifically is a bacterial infection. It's caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. And sometimes when people have an acute new infection with this, it's called yersiniosis, which sounds maybe a little less scary than plague. So the bacteria are carried by small mammals that have fleas on them. So the bacteria will be inside the fleas. The fleas are living on rats, mice, voles, gerbils, prairie dogs. And when those little tiny mammals that are carriers of fleas are in your house, you will get exposed to those fleas and you'll get exposed to plague. And again, people were getting bit and they were itchy all the time. When people get plague, there are 3 different ways that it can present. Bubonic plague is actually the preferred type, even though bubonic plague, in the way we think about it culturally, sounds really bad, and it is. Bubonic plague, though, is the better option. Bubonic plague causes lymph nodes to swell, and swollen lymph nodes are called buboes medically. And you can see in this picture that there are some buboes at the top of this person's legs. And I've got a zoomed in picture of what a bubo looks like. We have a lot of lymph nodes in our neck, under our armpits, and at the groin. And when people get swollen lymph nodes with bubonic plague, they can get so swollen that they can rupture through the skin. And obviously, if that would happen, then you're open to other types of bacterial skin infections. Second way that it can present is as pneumonic plague, where it causes lung problems, breathing problems, and that is often fatal. And it also can cause septicemic plague. That is relatively rare. When that happens, there's an infection of the blood that causes inflammation in the whole body that leads to gangrene in the extremities. So gangrene is when your body tissue is infected and it's breaking down. So it's kind of rotting while you're there. People with septicemic plague often lose their fingers and toes, even if they survive, because they've had poor blood circulation and they've had this gangrene that sets in. So humans mostly get infected from being bit by infected fleas. There is some new evidence that body lice may also be able to spread the Yersinia pestis bacteria between people. It's also possible to get infected if you have contact with infectious bodily fluids. So again, thinking back to your ancestors' times, if someone in the household got sick, that person was likely sharing a bed or sharing blankets with other people or sharing clothes, or if they died, then their clothes and bedding would have been passed on to the next person, perhaps without boiling it in very hot water first. So it can spread that way. It's also possible that it can be spread when people who have those lung infections, the pneumonic version, are exhaling, and they can exhale respiratory droplets that have the bacteria into the room. So a variety of ways it can spread. How do we know that when people were talking about plague, it was actually plague, right? Because sometimes, for example, in the Bible, it talks about leprosy, and leprosy could be interpreted as just meaning skin problem, skin infection, a rash. So how do we know that it's actually plague? We know that because we've had researchers go into burial grounds, and they've been able to get remains and look at genetic tests to see if they can find DNA evidence that there were bacteria involved in that. So we know that we had plague caused by Yersinia pestis in the Middle Ages, causing the Black Death. We have our first record of plague that was actually caused by Yersinia pestis in the years 541 to about 750. Those also, we have some records that that was actual plague. And it was pandemic, meaning not that it was super bad. Pandemic isn't about how severe it is, it's about how widespread it is. So there was plague across several continents, across Asia, Europe, Africa. So this has been around for a long time. The question then is, why did it get so bad? Why did it get so bad in the 1340s when it started spreading across Europe and became the Black Death? So the first plague that happened most likely came out of Asia, spread into the Middle East, spread into North Africa, and then crossed into Europe, especially in the southern part of Europe. The first plague pandemics that were happening in 541 to 750, we have no record that those made it up into the colder northern parts of Europe. But we do know that it showed up starting when things crossed into Europe in 1346. So we had a robust global trade system by that point in time. We had the Silk Road, Spice Road, fur trade. So the plague bacteria were endemic. They existed kind of all of the time in parts of Asia, and trade introduced that into Europe. And then that did spread through most of the continent. Norway was not in the first few years affected. So it came in through what's modern day Turkey in 1347, spread into places like Greece, Italy, and France in 1348, spread up into England and Germany in 1349, and then it made its way to southern Norway by the end of 1349 and spread north from there. What you'll see on this map, though, is there are some green spots. So green for most of Poland, some patches of green down by Andorra, in parts of Belgium. Those were places that have demographic records. They were doing things like censuses, trying to figure out who lived there. They did not ever have a significant problem with bubonic plague. So this was a little patchier than you might have envisioned. There were places that were heavily affected and places that were not affected much at all. So then the question is, by comparison, how bad was it in Norway? We know that there are some heavily affected places. where demographic records are showing that 30 to about 50% of the total population died when plague arrived in that community. We know that from church records, from tax records, from other demographic people counting. The risk of death was a bit higher among older adults, but basically this was an equal opportunity thing. It affected babies and children and young adults and older adults. And in some places, this devastated populations with a very high case fatality rate. The other way, though, that we can back this up, because not every place has records, or if they had records, they may have been lost to fire or floods or other events in the past several hundred years. So it's also possible to use pollen samples from core samples taken down into soil to look at how land use changed over time. So the way this would work is if you live in an agricultural area, which is most of the world back in the 1300s, and there's a high mortality event, you are going to have a lot of fields that were being farmed go fallow. So the pollen that's being produced is going to shift from things like corn or rye or wheat to wild plants. And that evidence will be buried in the soil so we can look down and see what we see. By contrast, if plague goes through a country and an area isn't much affected, so they have a low mortality rate, they're going to keep farming. And so we won't see that change in pollen types. And so using that method, researchers have been able to create a map of where in Europe they see evidence that there was a high case fatality rate. The dark pink areas here show the places that had the greatest number of deaths relative to their proportion. And you see that by that, Norway looks really bad. So a lot of Norway, southern Sweden, parts of France, parts of Greece were heavily hit, while other places like Ireland and Poland really not affected very much. And these records happen, not unexpectedly, to line up very well with the demographic information. So where church records, government records are saying there was a heavy burden, this method validates that, and places that don't have a heavy burden, this validates that. So we have evidence that even though Norway was relatively late to have plague arrive, when that second pandemic was spreading across Europe, it was heavily affected when it did arrive. We do still have plague being diagnosed every year. This is the part where you get to be freaked out a little bit. So you will notice Europe does not have plague. The US, however, the Western US is not just a place where plague could happen. It is a place where plague actually does happen every year. I also circled Madagascar there, and we're going to come back to Madagascar in just a moment. So you may be thinking, how many hundreds or thousands of people in America are dying of plague? You were not aware that this was a risk. And that's probably because on average, we have 7 people get diagnosed a year. And I think it's been quite a long time since we had anybody die from it. So we still have it. You can see in this picture here from an Associated Press report, this is a warning sign about bubonic plague on a prairie dog mound outside the main gates of Dick's Sporting Goods before a baseball game. So plague is around us, but for us, this is not something that we're worried about becoming a pandemic. Even the most heavily affected places, like Madagascar, which has had the biggest outbreak in recent years, it's not anything like what we saw in Europe hundreds of years ago. So in the Madagascar outbreak in 2017, there were more than 2,000 cases diagnosed. Most of them were the pneumonic form that's in the lungs, although there were some that were bubonic that involved swollen lymph nodes. About 8% of the people who became infected did not survive. And again, pneumonic is more fatal than bubonic. But if we hadn't had antibiotics, that would have been more than 90% because it was pneumonic. So the people who got sick died within a week of onset of symptoms. This was a really bad event, but the case survival rate was greater than 90%, very different than back in the Middle Ages. So why does plague only cause a few thousand cases and maybe several hundred deaths worldwide each year? So first one is we have a whole lot less contact with rats. And if we have less contact with rats, we will have fewer exposures to fleas. And so we'll have fewer cases. And that is true in most places in the world. Most places that had housing that was housing that rats would want to live in the world, people aren't living that way. We've got better housing standards. Second is we do have antibiotics. Now, it's not a guarantee that if you get antibiotics, you survive. You have to start antibiotic therapy very quickly after people get pneumonic plague for them to be effective. But in a place like Madagascar, once people were aware that it was pneumonic plague, people who had symptoms could get antibiotics right away. And the last one is we now have vector control. We have insecticides, so we can use chemicals to kill fleas and lice, so fewer people are getting bitten, which is a good thing because, again, going back to imagining how itchy your ancestors were is something that will make your skin crawl, literally. So with that bit of an introduction into what plague is, I'm going to turn this over to Alexis to talk about how Norway in particular was affected by the plague pandemic.
Oh, thank you very much. Hang on just a sec. Here we go. Can everybody see it? Okay, great. Thank you, Katja. I'm going to be talking about the consequences of the Black Death and the second pandemic, socially, economically, with regard to religion and the church, politically, and psychologically / emotionally, based on information I've collected over the last, let's say, few years, and especially because in doing genealogy, I keep coming across ancestors who've had some interaction with the second pandemic. So before I start, I want to introduce you to a character. Her name is Pesta. You can see her lovely self on the left side of the screen. She has two tools at her disposal. In this painting by Kittelsen, she's holding a rake. The tines in this medieval rake are wide spaced, and if you see Pesta with a rake, you are in luck, because there's a chance that you may be able to slip through without touching the tines and survive exposure. If you see her other tool, which is a broom, know that your moments are numbered. So here we go. Preconditions to the second pandemic. What was going on in Northern Europe? We had, weather-wise, what's called a medieval warm period or a medieval climate anomaly that lasted about 400 years. And during that time, the weather was nicer. Agricultural improvements were made. Crop yields improved. Population increased. And as that was going on, populations across Northern Europe tapped into this and they said, hey, you know, I can get more land. I can go up, you know, a couple hundred feet in elevation. I can go up a little bit north. I can plant in this area that used to be soggy. And I'm happy as a clam doing all this. We also colonized Iceland. We colonized Greenland, and you know about the short visit to Lanso Meadows. Well, all good things come to an end. Right around 1275, things started to change. There was a new acronym for you to digest called the Late Medieval Agrarian Crisis. And this was predominantly the Little Ice Age acting. And as a consequence of cooler and wetter summers and slightly colder winters, there were reduced crop yields, increasing human and livestock diseases. Those lands that had been tapped during the medieval climate anomaly now were becoming increasingly risky. And as time went on during the Little Ice Age, the use of those arable lands, or previously arable lands, constricted. Famines ensued. There's the most famous one is called the First Great Famine. And it occurred shortly after the onset of the Little Ice Age around 1317 to 1322, something like that. And hundreds of thousands of people starved to death in Northern Europe. Now, the LIA was a confluence of 4 different factors. One was increased volcanic activity in the southern hemispheres. Second, altered ocean currents, especially the East Greenland current, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Third, atmospheric current oscillations. There's a major one that floats kind of over the North Atlantic and has a node often over Portugal and Spain, or a node over Baffin Island, Ellesmere Island, west of Greenland. And depending on what those atmospheric currents are doing, you can get adverse weather conditions for long periods of time. The other thing that the scientists have confirmed is during the Little Ice Age, there were periods of markedly fewer sunspots, so that the solar radiation reaching our planet declined. So it's the confluence of those 4 factors that triggered the onset of the Little Ice Age, which lasted longer and started before the second pandemic. So I get to talk about marine science for at least 3 seconds and show this graphic, which is basically that during the medieval climate anomaly, there was so much melting of sea ice and calving of the glaciers that there was a huge quantity of fresh water coming off of both sides of Greenland. In particular, though, the East Greenland, and therefore I mentioned the East Greenland current. It was a freshet, and by that I mean it's fresh water, it's not more dense seawater. Although it was cold, it was still less dense than the marine salt waters, and it came down the East Greenland coast. It intersected with the heat transport that comes up across the North Atlantic, which is, as we know, the Gulf Stream. It rode up that way, and after decades and decades of doing that, the sea ice was advancing. The heat transport across the North Atlantic greatly declined, and you see the red arrow crossing north of Ireland, Scotland, going along the main part of the west coast of Norway. And this author, Ulmer, seems to think it even looped around, the sea ice even blocked the transport into the Arctic. So there were some serious goings on in the ocean currents during this time. But there is some evidence that it actually was really, really cold. We have data, information, current records, and old records that the Baltic Sea froze over twice in the early 1300s, which is not long after the onset of the Little Ice Age. Glaciers expanded. In the Stavanger Diocese, there's a report of a record from 1569, how cold the winter was, and 10 to 12 feet of snow. And a century later, still, the Swedish army felt confident enough, after probably observing repeated freeze-overs, that they could march their army along with munitions, probably cannons pulled by wagons, horses, etc., crossing from mainland Sweden to the island of Zealand, where Copenhagen is. That's pretty impressive. So the Little Ice Age continued throughout the second pandemic, and this past week I was looking for a better graphic and came across data from the University of Oslo and USGS that they have extended the time frame for the Little Ice Age another half century. So for Norway, it goes from 1300 to 1900. So, okay, so what was the deal with the plague? And what does the plague mean? Katja's talked about the epidemiology of it, but the second pandemic was repeated occurrences. And that was something that got my curiosity going, because I was like, well, how many were there? Where were they? So I went looking for information. Now, over the 306 years during which there were outbreaks in Norway, there's an average mean frequency of reoccurrence of about 10 years. And that's approximately the same for rest of mainland Europe. However, there are variations, and it depends on how good your data is. So I took two tables created by Ole Benedicto. I've added to them and modified it with information from Christensen, and I'm going to show you what it looks like. When the data allows source country on a plague episode that hits Norway to be identified, it gets a red check. So here we go. Late Middle Ages. We've got columns. I've got time going down the left. Norway is the big column in the middle. Low Countries, England, and Denmark. I've added Denmark. That data was not in any of Ole Benedicto's tables. Under Norway, I've tried to put locations or regions where information I could find indicated that was the case. So I've labeled 3 in bold under Norway. Those are named events. And you can see under England, they have the most red checks as you look down its column. The Low Countries have just 1 in the late medieval period. Ole Benedicto used a notation, a question mark in parens, to indicate when he didn't have any information to indicate the absence or presence of a plague event in Norway, so it's just blank. Mimicking that, but being distinct still, I put the question marks under Denmark for the same purpose. So we've got a whole bunch of repeat events, and we move into the early modern period, and we continue to have some. Only now you can see the Low Countries have more red checks than England. And once you get into the 1600s, you started seeing them from northern Germany. And the last event that hit Norway hit Oslo Fjord. And I put a red check by Denmark on this. This is me doing that because they had an outbreak that same exact time. So, where did it come from? Well, it's always from external sources. There's no Norwegian reservoir of plague bacteria. It's from ships, maritime trade. So in the 1300s, maritime trade with England dominated. But it doesn't mean that the plague necessarily came from England. It's the ship that came originally from England. It stopped in ports before departing England. It stopped possibly in an intermediate port before getting to Norway. As time goes on during the second pandemic, once you hit 1500s, it's more likely to have ships from northern Germany be identified as the source of the plague. 100 years later, it's more likely that it's from the Netherlands. Shipping during this time, especially on the West Coast, was getting influenced by the Hanseatic League's activities out of Bergen, and they were providing goods and trade income, in particular for the Norwegians on the far northern coast. They would be meeting up with the Norwegians coming down and bringing their dried cod for trade and exchange for supplies. And northern Norway really didn't get hit that bad relative to the rest of the country. It was viewed as basically self-sufficient as far as grains. It definitely had a low population and had fewer outbreaks. But if you look across where I remarked about after 1599, you start seeing more ships from Netherlands. They had broken out from the yoke of Spain and were probably delighted in their independence, and their economy started booming. They wanted to build more ships, they wanted to build houses, they were building factories, and they wanted Norway's timber, and the easy places to find it were from the small ports along the south coast. And here you can see Pesta, and she's got her broom, so watch out. So what happens to the social and population in Norway? Well, there was a drastic population loss. Katja mentioned up to 50%, possibly with the Black Death. There are estimates that are in the literature now that indicate it could have been as high as 60% when they start looking at population levels sustained after the Black Death through a good portion of the second pandemic. And they're estimating that they think the pre-pandemic, pre-Black Death population levels were not even reached until sometime in the 1600s. And I bet it's probably into the 1700s. With Norway being an agrarian society, obviously most of the people were farmers. And if you're going to take half the population, you're going to, on average, take a heck of a lot of the farmers. That resulted in a lot of land being deserted. They're called urdegards. And whether or not the people died there or they had so many fewer people and they had multiple plots of land and they picked a better, more productive place to live, you can't ascertain. Family life altered. With a limited labor pool, they're very conservative reaction to the stress and to expand farming. They don't have people to do it. And they probably were quite concerned about the survival in the base case. The literature on Norway's population levels basically concludes that after every regional outbreak post the Black Death, any interim population recovery was eliminated so that the country was in a situation of population stagnation. So economically, you've lost people, you've lost farmers who were generating a lot of your food. If you're not a subsistence farmer, you've lost your tradesmen, your carpenters, your blacksmiths, merchants. And so your economic machines have been slowed and have to adapt to this new situation. There are estimates of crop production hits that 200 years later, it's still at 35% of pre-plague levels, right? So it's not recovering. It's staying at a very low static percentage. Now, if you've lost people and you're a landowner and you had tenant farmers who were paying you in food, paying you in cash, if you're a wealthy person or a nobleman, you might have made loans and you want your money back. And if people died and the family was wiped out, you're not getting your income, you're not getting repaid. And if they're alive but barely surviving, they don't have the ability to do either. Now, the nobility and the landed elites lost a lot of their economic strength this way. They also proportionally had a higher percentage of mortality than in Sweden or Denmark. And I'm not sure why that is, but I have a suspicion. And another author I read also remarked about this, that the topography in Norway was basically, if you were rich and you wanted to have a nice estate and the associated farmlands, you wanted good farmland. So you're not going to build on top of a mountain, even though that would be a distance away. Sweden and Denmark are relatively flat in contrast. So the Norwegian elites were closer to sources of plague outbreak. With decline in national economic strength, you get sort of dismissed. Norway had not been self-sufficient for food beforehand. They were an importer of grains. When the state loses so many people and the rich who would be making payments as well aren't getting paid, the overall income to the state to conduct its business declined. And it took its toll. And as here's an example, the Hanseatic League had been operating out of Bergen for probably the better part of a century. And before King Haakon died in 1380, they made a bid to get control of the sea trade out of Bergen to the king for a fee. The king acquiesced. He got some cash, which he needed. And the Hanseatic League got control of the trade on the west coast of Norway. And this Norwegian website remarked they retained a leading role in Norwegian foreign policy for the next 2 centuries. But there are some positive things here. Survivors, because of the smaller labor pool, had a wider choice of vocations. People were going to be bidding for their services. They could change the land they were working on because there were opportunities with all the abandoned farms. And any survivor had the possibility to inherit proportionally more. If you had a family of 8 children and 5 of them died, they can divide it proportionally to a much smaller group. There was an economic and population recovery. Data indicates it was by region. And logically, you would think that just because of how frequently regions were hit or not by reoccurring plague outbreaks. Northern Norway started first, 1520s or so. Southwest, Rogaland, Hordaland, about in the mid-1500s. But the word slowly is emphasized. Oslo Fjord region, slowly. And I'm not even sure I believe that date range because of the last hit in 1654. Southern Norway had a lot of small hits, and they're estimated to have started real economic recovery after the 1580s. So what was going on with the Catholic Church and religion in Norway? The Catholic Church, this is my mental construct, was an integral part of the governing of Norway. The bishops communicated internationally. They communicated to the nobility, to the royalty, and they were part of the structure of the community. Well, so what happened? During the Black Death, not the second pandemic, but the Black Death, 4 of the 5 mainland Norwegian bishops died. So that's 80% mortality. Only 1 in Denmark and none in Sweden. Many of the other priests died too, because they were on the front line of baptism, marriage, last rites, burial, counseling. So here's some examples. In 1349, before Stavanger got hit by the Black Death, 7 parishes in Agder County had. They sent a plea to the bishop, please send priests, because they hadn't had any. And it's required by law that they go to church. It's required for last rites so your soul can go to heaven. So the bishop did a good deed. He sent many, and they all died hastily. Now, there were 300 priests in the Nidaros diocese before the Black Death. A generation later, let's say, 1371, there were only 40 older ones remaining. That's a huge hit, approaching 90%. Now, here's an interesting one. The Bishop of Bergen died in the Black Death. His replacement sent a request to the Pope to waive canon law for the requirement for legitimate birth and for age over 25. The latter basically ensured that you had had an education, you had gone to theology school, you had taken your exams, and you had been ordained by a bishop. So they're blowing out 2 of those. And one author reported that from records he had found, some of the priests were just 18 years old. As a consequence of the stark population loss, including priests, parish boundaries were sometimes redrawn because there were too few people and priests. Now, what was going on with the church? Well, the church got lots of gifts. They got candlesticks, they got priest stools, they got altar tables, and the object would be at that time to reduce one's time in purgatory. And there's data that show the increase in gifts with the onset of a plague outbreak. It's one of the proxy data sets. And another thing that was given by people is land. Now, land became easier to give away because there were so few people and not enough to farm it all. And as a consequence, the church became a major landowner. And not only that, they had enough money to buy the abandoned farms. And so they were second only to the crown as far as who owned the most land in Norway. Now, the Catholic Church took a major hit with the Reformation by fiat. There was a long struggle, I would say, in Norway about that. And with the successful Reformation, many of the Norwegian Catholic priests who would not wish to reform were replaced with Danish ones. So what's going on in Norway as far as a country? Well, they didn't have many people to begin with. So proportionally, the impact of the death of one is greater than, for example, in Sweden or Denmark, who had populations. Denmark's population was at least maybe 3 times that of Norway in 1/20th of the land mass. So 20 years after the Black Death, I found a letter. Queen Marguerite, King Haakon VI's wife, she wrote her husband and said that Akerhus Fortress in Oslo needs food. And you would think the queen would have the ability to have food and to have money to get food. But apparently not. Now, over time, during the second pandemic, the proportion of nobility that died and the other landed elites was also greater than in Sweden and Denmark. And these people would have been the ones who were leading the government, were part of the state council, led defense, led the ship reads, conducted international negotiations, treaties, etc. And that reduced ability to self-government has been described as a paralysis. And I've got some indicators of that, I think. Already, at the time of the Black Death, the Norwegian king was a young son of the Swedish king, and the young man was, I think, 8 or 10 years old. The Kalmar Union formed, which was a short-lived but contentious, I would say, union of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. At the beginning, Norway entered as an equal partner. By the end, she was not. A half a century after the formation of the Kalmar Union, the discussions in country between the remnant Norwegian nobles was not who to offer on the Norwegian side, but who to pick on either the Swedish or the Danish side. And in fact, nobles from those 2 countries were conducting incursions into Norway and battling it amongst themselves as to who could get Norway. Benedictus used this phrase, fall of the Norwegian state in 1536. And that coincided not only with the population minimum, because people are looking at, scientists are looking at, okay, post-Black Death, Norway's population cratered to maybe 50%. Okay, from that, there was another major hit in, 1529, 1530, that lowered the population even more. And 1536 also coincides, approximately 1536, 1537, with the Reformation by fiat. All subsequent rulers were either Danish or Swedish. And recently I came across this term, the 400-year night, which refers to the span of time from death of King Haakon VI to the Treaty of Kiel, when Denmark ceded Norway to Sweden. So it gives you a sense of what they were thinking about themselves, what was happening. And this shows you some geography. So Greenland is off screen to the left, and it would have been in bright red. Norway owned Iceland, the Faroes, the Shetlands, the Orkneys, Caithness, which is the diocese on far northern Scotland and mainland, the Inner Hebrides, the Outer Hebrides, the coast of northwest Scotland, which is showing in blue as Kingdom of the Isles. They also owned that thumb of land that heads down into what is now Sweden, was Bauhausland. They also owned 3 districts. Jämtland is the most famous, which makes that fat area in the eastern middle part of Norway, which they lost to Sweden. And what intrigued me also is the tax territory in brown, which in part is now Finnmark, and in large part now is part of Murmansk, the Kola Peninsula, circling around to parts of the White Sea, which I had no idea till I was staring at this map. And if you look on the right, you can see current holdings, which are much reduced. The only other medium green on that map is Svalbard, which is a multinational governmental controlled island, of which Norway is asked to be the formal governing country. Now, what other political events were going on during the entirety of the second pandemic? Well, there were some efforts to reduce infections. They didn't have a concept of infectious disease, though. They didn't even understand why it was happening to them. Were they being bad people? The severity and the shock, probably socially, stopped them from normal analytical thinking. Frequent efforts were to pray and stop sinning, none of which breaks a route of exposure. Prohibiting pigs and cleaning the streets may have prevented some diseases, of course, but didn't help with the plague. Isolation sometimes occurred and was observed to work, but they didn't understand because they didn't have the concept of infectious disease. Finally, like 250 years later, by the early 1600s, officials began to take steps to limit the spread. They had got the glimmer that if they can isolate, then they could control the spread. They might not be able to prevent occurrence because it's coming in the maritime trade, but they could limit. The plague orders executed in 1625 were the first anti-epidemic legislation for Denmark, Norway. 275 years after the Black Death. So the Kalmar Union, Norway passed through it and out of it, I suppose. With the death of King Haakon VI, Norway was in a personal union with Denmark. And then by 1536, the Danish king took on a very autocratic role and declared reformation by fiat and started really taking strong control of Norway. There were a lot of wars going on during that time. If you ever go searching for how many wars was such and such country in, you get lists of hundreds. It's battle this, battle that, 3 years more, another year, you get 6 months off. I picked the top 5. The 100 Years' War was ongoing during the Black Death and the initial period of the second pandemic. The Nordic 7 Years' War, Norway participated in that because of Denmark. The Kalmar War, the 30 Years' War and the Great Northern War have direct linkages to the topic of this presentation because refugees brought the plague to cities. In 1629, refugees from the 30 Years' War brought the plague to Bergen. And refugees brought the plague to Copenhagen in 1711. So now I want to talk a little bit about the overall, effect of the population loss, the economic decline, the impact on the church and the mortality of the priests, the political effects. What was going on with the people? It must have been exceedingly difficult. And I come up with that it's probably or possibly a chronic case of nationwide PTSD. And I'm going to talk about an example shortly. But I think there were lasting emotional effects. And I was looking in the literature for some analysis or presentation of information about what the academics in Norway or what the rulers in Norway, did they discuss this issue, hundreds of years ago? I don't think they did. It wasn't, I've seen a few remarks, I should say, literate people writing and bemoaning the state of Norway, but nothing more analytical than that. Harrison stated it was the main cause, plus contributing factors, of which I know of 3. 1, the Little Ice Age. It's still there. Things are still cold. Things are still, in shorter growing seasons, not the best growing seasons. And then Denmark and Norway, which were battling it out in what is referred to as the dynastic battles for who could claim Norway. Well, kings and bishops blamed sinning, and that was not very helpful. You probably heard of flagellants, the group in Central Europe and maybe Italy and France mostly known. They were, whipping themselves, hoping that that would solve the problem. People targeted others and decided, well, they must be a witch. Maybe we'll get that person and the plague will go away. Same thing for anti-Semitism. That didn't work either. So you see the effects of the plague on art, music, literature, and dance. And here's Pesta climbing up the stairs. This last quote I thought was quite illustrative. It's in the age of nationalism, however, it became shameful to be subjugated by one's neighbors, in particular to always be a little brother to Denmark and even worse to Sweden. And here's my example of emotional effects and protracted emotional toll on people and how that's illustrated. So I have many Heibergs in my ancestry. And I was given a book, the Slettende Heiberg book, and I read about that some decades ago, actually, and learned about Jostedalsribben, which is the Jostedal parish ptarmigan or snowbird. And there's an origin story. It can't be proven or disproven. but it's intriguing nonetheless. And I'm going to tell you sort of the general version because there are several. It takes place on Sognefjord. There are some villagers there, and there's rumors they must be coming in about the Black Death coming. And these villagers decide they're not going to fight. They don't see anybody successfully fighting. They're flighting. According to the story, they go all the way inland to the end of Sognefjord and upland to Jostedal. They must have, in my brain, have thought, we got to take tools, we got to take whatever extra clothing we have, food stuff, some of our livestock, anything that they could think of to help them survive, because they were going to a new place without any housing. So they would have to get there, build something that enabled them to survive over an unknown period of time. So the story goes on that I'm guessing it's the next late winter, because you don't see any snow in this painting. The artist romanticized version of this. Early spring. There are 5 men who knew the villagers had gone inland to escape the Black Death. The painting depicts the meeting with the young girl who is subsequently called the Reapin, the snowbird, the ptarmigan. And you don't know, well, she's the only survivor. So what happens to the other ones? Well, they could have frozen to death. They could have starved to death. They could have had the plague and brought it with them and not known it, or a combination of all three. So if you think about the Heiberg family, the first 2 known in this family were not identified or even in records until mid-1600s. So that's, 300 years after the Black Death. In the 1700s, I'm going to say the mid-1700s, I have seen a photograph of an engraved silver tankard that has a facsimile of this family crest on it. So that's 400 years. This painting was done in the second half of the 1800s. So that's 500 years. The second edition of Sletten de Heiberg, which had the color version of this crest, was published in 1947, which is 600 years. And then when I was looking for some information about Jostedalsriepen, I discovered, and Alan, this is for you, Jostedals Historielog has a webpage. And guess whose webpage it is? Specially built just for Jostedalsriepen. So now we're in the current modern computer age, and the Riepen has her own website. You can learn about archaeological digs that have been undertaken to study the abandoned farms and to discover if they have been reactivated. They're looking at fires, they're looking for pottery, they're looking for signs of habitation. You can also read about when a famous bishop came by and the villagers told him all about Jostedalsriepen. So it's 675 years and this story has not gone away. On the left is the family crest. There was a letter sent to the author of Sletten de Heiberg. It was an older cousin who remarked in her letter that this is a non-military female family crest because of the Riepen. I don't know if that's true. It's one of those things. I think you can't prove it, you can't disprove it. But let's look at the crest. On the right side, we have the snowbird, which is great. She's got a little sprig in her beak, sign of rebirth and spring. And I know I have medical types on this call. So the bird's feet are on top of some interesting shapes. We've got a spine bone. I see a clavicle bone. I see some leg bones. I think there's arm bones. And she's standing on top of a jumble of bones. On the left is a typical skull and crossbones signifying death. This crest augments that with the hourglass. That is showing all the sands are on the bottom. Your time is up. But what really creeps me out about this crest is the open helm and the face in the open helm. And I hope you can see it, which is why I kept this graphic a little larger. It's a face, and I assume it's a male. You can see the two eyes, the nose, and to me, it looks like he's got the 1,000-yard stare. So let's do a quick synopsis. We've got 306 years, at least 24 outbreaks, drastic population loss, weakened economy, hits to the Catholic Church, Reformation, reduced ability to govern, and a lasting emotional toll. We've got a few positives. Improved livelihood for peasants. Survivors could inherit proportionally more. And finally, officials began to grasp that there are acts that they could take to break the route of exposure and limit infections. And so the Norwegians adapted and Norway survived. So let's get back to genealogy. So while I've been presenting, I'm wondering if you had a chance to think, oh, you know, I wonder about that ancestor. They were around in this time. They might have come in contact with one of the plague outbreaks. Well, that's definitely true. This graphic I've modified. I've added the 2 dashed vertical bars to show the time limits on the span of the Little Ice Age. The previous person who modified it put in, which I think is very important, that long green lozenge, which indicates time going back from the year 2000, which would be the right border, going back to the left, hundreds of years, where we are looking for genealogical records, whether vital records, studies, whatever we can find in government records that aren't primary vital statistics. I have added to it again by putting a black lightning bolt for the Black Death and indicating the time span for the second pandemic. So the second pandemic covers almost half of the period of time for genealogical studies. So now I'm going to give you some examples of my ancestors who have been impacted by the second pandemic and connections in chronological order from the Black Death to the most recent. Starting off, he's not a direct ancestor, but I'm counting him for the purposes of this. 19th great uncle, Halvard, he was Bishop of Hamar. He was the first Norwegian bishop to die in the Black Death. Ole Benedictu, who's done a lot of research and analysis of tracking the movement of the plague infection across the land in Norway, tried to figure out when some of these significant people died so he could have an understanding. And based on the process to consecrate a replacement bishop, Halvard died in the second half of August 1349. The other 2 people in row 2 also died in the Black Death. The bishop's sister's son, my 18th great-grandfather, Brynjolf Haraldsson Pus, and his common law life partner, wife, because he couldn't be married, Ellen Engelbrecht's daughter. Brynjolf Haraldsson had in the early 1320s been sent to Avignon, France, to deliver Norway's hard currency Peter's pence tax payment to the Pope. And I don't know if that's why he went again about 25 years later. And I haven't found it yet, but I have a suspicion. In any case, they made the trip together to the papal palace at Avignon, where they died of Black Death. And I've been trying to think myself of, okay, I know it's before May 1349 because there was a letter from the Pope announcing the replacement canon for Oslo Diocese, which means somebody had to carry a letter during the Black Death and go from Avignon to the diocese and find out who was still alive that could be nominated, and then travel and not die on the way back during the Black Death. So I think actually considering that, plus that shipping was essentially closed down from mid-October to mid-April, that Brynjolf Haraldsson and his wife, common law wife, went in late 1348, and that they died sometime in that winter. But I don't know, that's my suspicion. Row 2, I don't know who died, but in 1411, my 16th great grandfather, Glur Olafsson Greeny, was summoned in his role as a magistrate to travel north in Buskerud County to Hedenstad to hear testimony about contested boundaries at deserted farms, right? Katja's mentioned that. She's shown that map with that huge expanse of land where there are deserted farms. Well, the legal system is working. There's a claim filed that new farmers are alleged to have encroached, and he was called in to adjudicate this issue. Third row, 150 years later or so, my great-grandfather, number 11, John Sigurdsson Nomland Helle, was a farmer, and he purchased some new land in Val Parish, a municipality in Aust-Agder County, which is in northern Setesdal Traditional District. Well, his land purchase included a deserted farm, so he was one of those who reactivated an Erdegardman. When the plague happened there, I don't know. It was before the land purchase at some time. The fourth row, this is an interesting one. There was a court complaint filed in Rebiggelad Court in 1605 against my 9th great grandfather, Torleif Asmundsson Rignestad, because he did not, per convention, cover the food and board expenses for a missed meeting, and his business colleague took issue and filed. Well, Torleif Asmundsson was a very literate guy, and I'm sure he dashed off a note, and we're reading from the court clerk back to us what he said. A strong prohibition was read from the Lord Sheriff, who was Lensherr Peter Grub, in Rebiggelad, that no one should go anyone from their house while the pestilence reigned, so Torleif did not dare to travel. And you wonder about the other guy. Did he break the prohibition? You don't know. But Benedictu, who's been analyzing data and wondered where did this prohibition come from, because usually it's a very top-down approach. He looked for the royal governor's records for any instructions that had been sent out across to all the Lensherrs in Norway. He found nothing. He looked for royal instructions. He found nothing. So he was in the place of thinking, well, maybe Peter Grub on his own initiative made this prohibition. And he thinks it's the first Norwegian government action to prohibit the spread of the plague. Fifth row, my 10th great grandmother, Margaret Bentdarvik. She died in 1625, that's early fall, in Mandal Parish, a municipality in Vest-Agder. I think she was actually in the port town of Mandal because her husband had been a a lagman, and they had their own farm for the people of that position, lawyers, high-level judges. And I think because she was in the port, she had a completed route of exposure and got the plague and died. The outbreaks of plague in the southern ports reflected, remember I mentioned that growing Netherlands timber business and their economy, and lots of their ships were coming to Norwegian ports. The last row, this occurs in 1654. This is the last time there's an outbreak in Bergen, in Oslo Fjord, but this is not tied to the theology professors left Copenhagen due to an outbreak. My 8th great grandfather, Jens Samuelsen Boog, was a student, and he and his other students were left without the possibility of taking their exams. Well, I learned recently that he was living in the University of Copenhagen's rector's house. My 10th great grandfather, Ole Claus Wilhelmsen Worm. And so I can imagine Jens Samuelsen is going, well, I have to take my exams, otherwise I can't get ordained, and then I won't have a job. And who knows when the professors will come back, or even if they survive. So he asked Ole Claus Wilhelmsen for help. And with all of the connections that Ole Claus had, he contacted Jorgen Holdersen Rosenkrantz, also known as the Learned Rosenkrantz. And he's a nobleman, but in his learned role, he was the principal of the Sorel Latin School. And I've seen a transcription of the letter that Ole Claus wrote, which he gave to Jens Samuelsen in sending him off to Sorel, which is an introductory letter explaining the situation to Rosenkrantz so that the latter could make arrangements for the young theology student to take his exams and travel home, get ordained, etc. Well, he did. He passed the exams. He became a priest at Leikanger Parish in Sogn So these are the types of things you can find as the Norwegians adjusted to what the horrors were going on around them, but they still persisted. So with that, I'll open it up for comments and questions.
That was fascinating.
Thank you.
I have a lot of questions. Did the livestock die just as fast as the humans?
I don't think so. I'll let Katja and then my brother answer that because I bugged him about this yesterday.
Let's let your brother answer.
Okay. Eric, are you still there? Oh, maybe they're not. So Katja, you're on point.
And would you like to maybe stop screen sharing so we can see people again?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, so plague, it depends what animals, but I'm not aware of like cow plague or something like that being a big deal. However, if people are sick and they're neglecting livestock, that's going to be a problem for the livestock.
Sure.
Since many records are gone or that, what record or government documents did you search that led to some of this information, or that the churches burnt down or whatever? So what area? I mean, I've had a relative going back to about 1700 of that, and then everything disappears of that because you can't find, certainly aside from birth records, you must have searched government records or that to lean what was, or gain information about what was going on in that particular area of Norway.
I didn't mention anything about churches burning. I said that parishes might have been collapsed together because the population was so low and they had so few priests because of the, I don't want to say preferential mortality, but higher than typical mortality that they were subjected to. And that's described in some of the books about the plague that I have bought, and it's in manuscripts as well that discuss this.
Hmm.
Who do you write a check to if you buy an abandoned farm?
Well, before I answer that, my brother's texting me. He says there's no known cow plague. He doesn't have a microphone on his computer. Oh, but you can write a check to him. He'll take it. After a certain number of years, I think the heirs were eventually found. The ability of the court system to find people who were still alive, networking out to find, extant family members more and more distant. Would have
Okay.
taken a while.
Sure. I'm amazed that it seems to me like something in the distant past, but it's really not.
No. And in fact, I sent Katja a short video clip I found last fall, which was, so obviously it's a video clip, it's new. It was, I don't know how they did it, but it's voiceover, and they have like a little ship coming into an old graphic Bergen airport, and there's this, not Bergen Harbor, and there's this very somber male voiceover talking about the first British plague ship coming in and all the horrors that happened as a consequence of this. Yeah, I think it's still in their mind. And while I showed the Heiberg origin story, I wouldn't be surprised that many of the larger families have similar ones.
It's hard to imagine that much death in your life. I don't know. It's just kind of hard to imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there any gravity to the Reformation success because of the Black Plague? Like,
Yes, I think it's linked, not one-to-one, but the consequence of the Catholic Church losing its image of invincibility.
right.
And once people started seeing that the church had faults, then it opens up other things. And I know the purchase of indulgences became a major factor as well.
But more generally, Alexis, I like your idea of saying this was a country with collective PTSD. How could it not be that there weren't just completely devastated survivors? And what that does to be in a place where every person is a devastated survivor.
Yeah.
My guess would be that any abandoned property would be taken over by somebody else as a homesteader.
Well, except for they had such a loss of population, there was way more land to farm than they had people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which is why then farms were abandoned for hundreds of years before the populations increased enough to search out and acquire new lands. Yeah, it's kind of scary.
This is a question probably more for Katja. I'm curious why it was specifically fleas on small animals that were the vector. Is it because they were able to get into people's houses and so expose them more directly? Or, I mean, or were the fleas on these small animals more likely to carry the bacterium?
Both. So first of all, fleas and ticks have different preferred hosts. So
Right.
the tick that carries the bacteria that cause Lyme disease, they like to live on deer and mice, right? They have a preferred host. And so partly it's just that is what their host was. But also the bacteria probably were ones that were especially suited to being able to thrive in that environment, just because that's genetically how those bacteria were. So it was, though, again, the rats and mice, you saw in some of those pictures, those just a sea of rodents. So yeah, we still occasionally have a mouse get into our houses, but it's not the same thing as having gaping holes where at night the rodents are coming in to sleep under your bed, next to your bed, coming into the house for warmth. So you're in very close proximity to them.
Any speculation on why the bubonic plague didn't make a manifestation in the United States as this country was founded? I mean, it carried over in the time period.
I have not done enough research to know how bad it was here. Now, when these conditions were happening, initially there was no cross-Atlantic trade happening. Obviously, later in those hundreds of years where it was happening, there was cross-Atlantic trade. It is likely, again, I haven't looked at the history in the Americas, but it's likely that it did spread. We have plague in the US West. It had to have gotten there somehow.
Ships.
If you don't die from it, is it because you're genetically lucky or just lucky?
A lot of it would be that maybe you were a little nutritionally stronger, able to fight it off, that maybe you hadn't just recently had another infection. People who would have had tuberculosis or other chronic infections or chronic diseases would not have had the immune system to be able to fight it off. But again, relatively equal opportunity killer in the sense that it targeted people of all ages, it targeted men and women. I suspect that people back then were aware that it was sort of a flip of a coin. And they'd say, how did this person survive and this one didn't? And that would have made it even scarier.
What are the reasons that we have for the, or that we know about for the green areas that you showed on the on the European map, like Poland?
That is a mystery. Maybe my co-presenter found something on that. We don't know if that is just where, say, different host animals were, a different type of rat that maybe wasn't as good a host. Maybe it was differences in trade partners and when things arrived. I wasn't able to find anything particular. Alexis, were you?
I'll say two things. One is each country that participated in the Erdegard project had its own research team, and their procedures were not identical. So it's not a one-to-one comparison across all nations. And then more than that, some countries might not have been as aggressively farmed beforehand. So it could be more that people were moving into different areas over time. And so what you're seeing is an increased farming because that's what was happening, rather than the Norwegian area, which had been farmed, and then they lost so much of their people and it dropped. So those are
I see.
some thoughts.
Interesting. Thanks.
I also remember reading about Berlin and about the 1700s where they would be blocking, they had gatekeepers essentially to enter their city. And so they had to have passes, and they apparently had some way in which they looked at somebody who might be wanting to enter their city, whether or not they looked healthy. And I don't know where that originated from, if it, it grew out of the history of, disease in their area.
I think it probably did, Sydney, because one of the things they talked about in the plague orders was, did people require a health certificate? Like you had to have that before you left your port of departure, before you could arrive on a ship. Overland, I don't know, but There were concepts like that, definitely.
Mentioned that they started cleaning up the streets. So they had soap back then, right? But was disinfectant, had that been discovered yet? Were they was one of the benefits of this awful events was more cleanliness?
Unfortunately, not so much. The germ theory of disease and the idea of contagiousness was a few hundred years later. Germ theory is really new in the span of world history. So no, they did not, unfortunately. They were aware that ships coming into ports could after they arrived, there could be disease in the port city. So there was this concept of contagion. So quarantine, the idea of ships sitting in the port for 40 days before you let people off, was there. But the idea of personal cleanliness was pretty far off.
Thank you.
My brother is opining. Washing hands would help body fluid transmission? Eric, you don't mean that. Not body fluid transmission. He's chatting with you guys on the chat.
Yeah, and again, hand washing, general hygiene was not that big a thing. So up until a little over 100 years ago, doctors didn't wash their hands before patients.
True.
They didn't really wash their hands before surgery. The hygiene hypothesis, this idea that cleanliness in that way with hand washing, even in a medical environment, is about 150 years old.
I lived in a isolated culture, if you will, for a few months at a time, and it was clear whenever a plane came in, within 2 days, Fred would go through the group, and of course hand washing did work, but that was modern times. But it was clear visitors meant sickness throughout the colds, in the form of colds.
Hmm.
I find it hard to believe that if I went prairie dog hunting and I went into the doctor and said, I don't feel so good, that they're going to say, oh, I bet you have bubonic plague. I mean, that'd be like on the bottom of the list. How are they going to come to that
Unless you
conclusion?
come in and you have buboes, you've got swollen lymph nodes rupturing out of your armpits, then they're probably going to say, have you been playing with prairie dogs recently? If you live in the US West.
Alexis, your comment about PTSD makes sense to me in a different way. One of the stories I read about a connection with an in-law of one of my ancestors. She was accused of being a witch and ultimately was burned at the stake. But she was accused. There were deaths, random deaths in the community, or random things that would be happening. Obviously, but it would be a cat, a cow, somebody's cow that died, somebody else's child got sick, and so the explanations I think that they were searching for. I mean, they were searching for a rationale for that happening, and therefore she was a witch.
The scapegoat.
Yeah.
Is anybody aware of any contemporary, I mean, other than, government records and church records, is anybody aware of contemporary writings that would be interesting to follow up on, as in primary sources of what life was like in this time period?
That's a good question.
And if you
Yeah.
feel free to think about it and, um, get back to us later on it, because I'd be interested in learning more.
Pretty morbid would be a safe guess, apparently.
What?
I can see if there are any published journals or diaries or letters from the period at the Library of Congress.
Oh, yeah, that would be great, Troy. Thank you.
Sure.
My if you want to send it generally, that would be great. But also my specific email is in the chat from when I gave it to Bill up top about the history talk tomorrow.
Could you send it again? I don't see it in the chat.
Sure.
Since the bubonic plague overlaps with the 400-year Danish reign or that, do we know how many Danish monarchs perished because of the plague?
I did not look for that information, but I don't recall seeing anything. That would have been a major big deal. So I don't know the answer, but
You would think so.
yeah.
So they say history repeats itself. So when we had our COVID, is that the history repeating itself?
It's a little different with a respiratory pathogen and ones that are spread more often through insects. So the risk that that the US would have a widespread plague outbreak are really minimal. We've got antibiotics. Granted, we have antibiotics now. They didn't back then, but just our living conditions are such that wouldn't happen. Respiratory pathogens like influenza and coronavirus, it is far easier for those to be a very fast pandemic to spread around the world very quickly. But yes, the idea that pandemics in general happen with these waves of cholera, waves of plague historically, and now waves of things like flu and COVID. Yeah, absolutely. This is spread through trade routes, whether it's ships or now airplanes, and then we spread it from the cities. We saw when COVID came in, it started in coastal cities and then spread to rural areas a few months later. So we still see that pattern.
I have this sense that death was so prevalent that you almost don't get close to your family because it might not last very long.
Well, if you look at places, including in our own past, where a lot of children did not survive, I don't think there's any evidence that parents were not just as captivated by their babies every time, and that the losses, I don't think just because they happened often were any easier. I think there's something about humans and how we bond with our families that creates those ties, even if we know that life is fragile. Which is not to say, again, that we wouldn't have had people with severe depression who were not bonding with people in the same way that they might have. But I suspect that the losses were incredibly hard. If we do get to find those journals or those contemporary writings, that it wouldn't be like, oh yeah, another family member died today. It would have been yet more tragedy strikes. How do we bear this?
Joel, we've been on the phone or on the Zoom call for a while. So before people start to leave, I just want to remind folks on the genealogy interest group that we have a presentation in February. Shirley Torhild is going to be making or presenting her analysis of how to distinguish between two men with the same name. A tale of the two Rasmus. So watch for the announcement about that. And if we have more questions for Katja and myself, please opine.
Well, I think we should give a big thank you to our speakers and also to all of the great questions from all of you.
Yes, thank you so much for all of your expertise and work in putting together the presentations.
It was wonderful. It was just wonderful.
I'll ask the question we usually ask presenters. Can we post your PowerPoint along with the recording of this meeting? There's a lot of good information in those PowerPoints.
Yeah, I'm not going to give you the PowerPoint, but I'll give you a PDF.
Great. Yeah, no, that's fine. That's fine.
And then a question for Katja as well, I assume.
I see her nodding her head.
I think I'm gonna come up with more questions tonight after I sleep on it.
It's addictive. You get into it and it's like, well, what about this? What about that? So, yeah. Well, thank you very much for your kind attention.
It's really, yeah, really a fascinating topic.
Thank you for doing this.
It's a lot of work. It's very, very enjoyable.
It's nice to see you too, Katja.
Yes, nice to see everybody. I was sorry I couldn't go to the lodge meeting last weekend.
Bye, everybody.
Have a good rest of your weekend.
You too.
Bye-bye.
So I mean, we've been on for a long time, Susan. But I'm sorry that you'll be away for this little. All I'm really intending to do at this meeting is sort of introduce the people that are working on it and kind of lay out some parameters for what what we'd like to accomplish. And I think you're kind of getting the idea from some of the ideas you put in the email, and so those are the kind of things we need to kind of talk over the next.
It's hard to follow Katja and Alex. It's pretty intimidating, their work, but they're wonderful. They're wonderful.
Yeah.
No, we've had just I've learned so much, and I think it's been really valuable. It'll be interesting to see how some of these things play out. It would be really fun, and I don't know how you would do it, but Alex and I are related, and when she was talking about Ole Worm today, he's my grandpa too, so that's a fun, that's just a fun thing, and I don't know how you could do that, but I'll